Hello, welcome to another episode of Global Pause Rethink the Future. So, in today's podcast, I want to do something a little bit different and look at maybe influential philosophers and kind of talk about or interpret their thought in light of the possibility that we're laying out. And one that I want to talk about today is Nietzsche, specifically the madman and the way how, God, Nietzsche's, if you understand, if you've read Nietzsche, he talks about the transvaluation of values as being one of the things that, the Übermensches or the people that come after him, as it were, should resolve upon in a way. So it's kind of, I thought that looking at, references for people when they're questioning our way of life and certain kind of figures within philosophy anyway, Western philosophy might be a good way just to kind of think about things in context of maybe what certain thinkers have thought. So with the parable of the madman, so one of the things that, when you look at his parable is that the madman goes into the market, seeking God, with his lantern, lighting lanterns in the day, and so it's this scene which, I don't know if you're privy to like the nutters that are in the city that usually invariably are quoting, the John's Apocalypse or whatever about the end is nigh. I'm not saying that this madman was anything kind of similar to that maybe we can all kind of relate to, but he's got that kind of comic kind of, I suppose, sense about him, about some crazy, everybody's going about their everyday business, and here he is coming in to kind of shatter the mundaneness of these people going about their business. So the thing is that, and that's where he makes a statement like God is dead and that we are his murderers. And so, but in the context, he says, because at the end he says that he's come too early. All right. Now, when I look at that statement, he's right in the context. This is the one thing which I have a problem with the whole the framing of it, is that literally he's talking about the transvaluation of values. Economics is where values are contested, and yet in the scenario, that scenario is the perfect opportunity in order to think of what it is that people are doing. So if God is dead, all right, and that, we killed him, well, how did we kill him? Now, he didn't die through 1,000 blows, as it were. He died through neglect. Well, then how is that neglect? How's the neglect? How's the binding force that was God? How does God die? Well, it dies through literally your mundaneness, your preoccupation with life in inverted commas. And so when the madman presents itself with the opportunity to actually draw some insight into his murderers, supposedly, the people that are in the market are literally trading with God's death. All right, so this is the one thing which I kind of find strange about it, in the sense that, Nietzsche talks about the transvaluation of values. You have people within the marketplace that are literally valuing. He's talking about God's death, and we would have killed God, this organizational principle or power that no longer animates the world, and so therefore, how has that come about? And yet that very, very scenario indicates exactly how, and yet like Nietzsche just didn't have the insight to actually see it for what it was, which is literally the remains of God exist within money. So if we think of like Osiris, and Osiris was cut up, and there's a lot of examples, even actually Nietzsche's favourite god Dionysus has been cut up, and I think it's called the my bloody pronunciation of any kind of Greek, let alone English, is really bad, but it's the Spa Marcos. I think it's the god that's pulled apart. All right, in the fury of the initiates or the devotees, as it were. But you have Osiris that is cut up by his brother Set. So the thing is that those pieces of that God are all traded. We trade with the remains of God, and we only have to consider our way of life, all right, in the sense that those people, when Nietzsche would have been accosting them in the marketplace, are modern in that regard, and yet he didn't have the insight to actually draw out some of his own philosophizing as far as what potential maybe exists there. So when you're looking at the context of his thought, well, it's all. I mean, yeah, it's all very well and good, and it's all aspirational. But when you're looking at actually how you can temporalize, or if you've got any insight into the actual issue, well, it's limited in its applicability, as it were. So let's think of one scenario, which is I think it's called the pharmakos, which is you're both, probably bastardise that saying, the pharmakos or whatever. So it's they're both the remedy and the poison. So there's another Greek term that is used. Now, it's not an ambivalent term, but it kind of derives from the nature of the sacred. The sacred is both a poison. So if you know René Girard, and René Girard's framing of, I suppose, what gave rise to being human, and we're talking about violence, how violence can be cathartic, to ultimately to remove through the surrogate a victim mechanism of the scapegoat. That violence removes what would otherwise be a violence that would a mimic violence or reciprocal violence that can destroy the community. And so through the sacrifice of a victim, then it proceeds to generate some kind of peace. And so over time, that person is deified to the point of being a god. So they're both, the violence is both poison and remedy. So if we think of ourselves being both poison and remedy, what's the context for the poison that we hold and for the remedy? So, so when you're looking at the context of being market orientated, that's what we're beholden to. So we are both a poison in the sense that our behaviour or what we're disposed to, what we consider to be worthy of ourselves as far as life goes, we perpetuate very much the thing that ensnares us. All right, so we don't do as Nietzsche said, I suppose, is to transvalue our values. All right, so look at something that's nobler, which obviously Nietzsche goes on about quite a lot about it, and ennobling action, something that claims, I suppose, the higher, the good, the higher good within yourself, or the soul or spirit, however you want to describe it, doesn't really matter. But then, so we play host to the disease, I suppose. So if you're looking at Nietzsche's understanding of kind of nihilism, you can understand that the nihilism that we face off with, if our understanding of what we value is circumscribed to a very small understanding of self-interest, and so therefore when we demonstrate values as within the market, then where is it that we're demonstrating any values that obviously that God, say at once back in the day, was the exemplar of? So in that context, we play host obviously to the disease, to nihilism. But then, well, where would you become the remedy? So in the context of especially Christian kind of theology, which is really what, when you think that what Nietzsche kind of railed against, it usually is his understanding of the Christian God, because, through all these other books, he kind of did go on about the, resentment, the caste of the priests, as it were, and how... So in that regards, like if we think of, and I've touched upon this, the understanding of nihilism. If you consider nihilism is a lot of thinkers over the course of Western intellectual history have kind of said that it's been a movement of nihilism. Whether or not you believe it or not, it's not necessarily, it's disputable, I suppose. But I suppose where we are, when we have context to where we are, well, it's pretty nihilistic, you would think. But then how has that come about? So, one of the things which he also... So he understood nihilism as deriving from maybe a Christian God, but then he didn't kind of trace out if if his whole thing was orientated towards life and yet the afterlife, so the understanding this spiritualized life, which kind of removes life from the world in the sense that, you know, as Christ said, my kingdom is not of this world, and yet the spirit has to kind of move itself through the world, and yet you must render unto Caesar at the same time. I mean, you've got these irreconcilable kind of statements that might presage, I suppose, the separation of church and state. But when you're looking for a new form of spirituality, the separation of church and state is something that actually ultimately has to be addressed. And this is the one thing that people kind of don't give it, they don't ever kind of think of it, because our understanding that when we frame that problem, it's always framed in context of the church, and the church is the problematic of, I suppose, of the Christian church throughout history, through Western history, and then the secular state. But when you're looking at autonomy, and you're looking at transvaluing values, and you're looking at a higher ideal that where once God was that ideal, well then you literally do have to face off with that separation, because then if you're putting into practice, and I always come back to, so a lot of things which I advocate requires faith, but it's not faith in a belief, like so belief in a transcendental, it's faith in a knowledge that what we're facing with. And so, you know, if you're talking in the context of transvaluation, the transvaluation of values, and you're talking about knowledge, the knowledge is simply just recognizing that money is not neutral, that money is a sheer claim on your temporality, and understand the way how that works. And it works through the when we receive ourselves as marginal, when we presuppose, you know, our time to be an economic good. And if it's an economic good and we're market orientated, it presupposes the use of money. And if it presupposes the use of money, that's the way how we secure our independence. And so when you're resolving upon what you value, when you say that you value your time, and your time is a supplement, is a afterlife to the life that you secured in your labouring, you emulate basically the God that Nietzsche took issue with if you're looking at the 7 days of creation. You know, so in that regard, he didn't look at it like that. He had an understanding of nihilism, but not to the degree where you understand how the afterlife kind of works, and the way how the afterlife works, especially within context of the statements attributed to Christ, that problematizes essentially what we're facing off with today. Because if it is a spiritual issue, it is a spiritual issue. It's a spiritual blight. So when you're looking at the exceptionalism, and so exceptionalism here, and this is why the exceptionalism is a way of actually merging both our understanding of the transcendent as far as God goes and secular power. Because ultimately, if you are sovereign, in inverted commas, sovereign, and, you know, you are sovereign in the sense that you can make an exception to a predisposed orientation towards history, really, and make a break, okay? And so therefore demonstrate maybe the transvaluation, as it were. Then how do you do that? And you only can do that within the context of the market where the madman was accosting everybody else. You can only do that with the remains of God that you actually trade with. Now, how do you take the remains of God, so the creative spark that actually exists within our everyday mundaneness, and take that and not necessarily create a ritual, a magic incarnation where you're going to take the severed remains of Osiris and then, you know, make him into the first mummy when you look at the myth. But essentially what you are doing, and this is what kind of like what I'm advocating in a strange kind of way, is that you're taking the remains of God, what remains, and when you think of how money is obviously usurped the position of God, and that's essentially the way how God becomes marginalised through the development of, say, you know, business and kind of this free enterprise and whatnot, and ultimately being orientated towards an afterlife that is, it's immaterialized, so it's literally fallen to earth. And this is the one thing that people don't kind of give due consideration when they're looking at what is a retirement, and then looking at, well, your afterlife was a retirement from life. It's the Sabbath. It's the same thing, all right? It's just immaterialized. So when you're looking at the remains of that God, you're literally looking at the creative portent of that heritage, but not being beholden to it. Because this is the one thing that we kind of are facing off with. If Christianity is not a mobilising force, what it was like a few hundred years ago, then can you utilise that it's tradition, but in a way that you can make good on it without being beholden to it? So a lot of people that are atheists, just all they do is that they have this understanding that, well, God doesn't exist, and so they spend all their time just kind of arguing about that God doesn't exist, which is just kind of stupid because, it's historical, it might be a fiction, but everything that's a fiction, or if it's created from the way how you understand, say, the sacred is created like Girard's understanding of the sacred, then the force that is embodied within the sacred is, you can't dismiss it as easily as what you would as being fanciful or anything else like that. It binds in a way where what it's doing, it's giving life to a community. Now, we live in a world where a lot of our religious secularized institutions basically have their genealogy in the sacred, and yet we like to think that we're somehow removed from the claim of the sacred, but we're not. I mean, we're not. It's just a delusion to think that we are, because ultimately, if you consider in the manner that Girard does, it's ultimately to do with violence. It's to do with violence. So when we're looking at the death of God, and you're looking at, so one of the things which Girard goes on about is the nature of sacrifice, substitution, So what would we potentially, if we're looking at it from the context, let's look at it from the context of sacrifice. So what do we emulate when you're being market orientated, and when we presuppose for ourselves independence as the ideal? Now, the ideal of independence is the embodiment of that ideal of independence is the sovereign, right? Is the king. Okay, the king is the closest as far as a temporal power that with all the mythology about the divine right of kings kind of illustrates the connection to the divinity, which is essentially, even if you look at the understanding of kingship and the nature of kingship within all traditions, and just only have to read René Girard to understand the connection there, then the sacrificial nature, what we have to sacrifice, if we are looking at a sacrifice, and so a sacrifice which is a self not in your whole being, as it were, but what you would consider to be the mobilising force in your life, which is our understanding of independence. So if we've individualised the pursuit of life to such a degree, then we're beholden to an undervalued utopianism. And so because money is a given, we resolve upon money as a ways towards the independence. Then the sacrifice is really sacrificing that sovereign self, our understanding of sovereignty, when you consider independence to be an ideal. So let's say, because people would like to think, well, that's somehow you're advocating a collectivism or something like that, but you're not. It's your understanding of people. So if we are market orientated and it presupposes the individualisation of life, of the unavowed utopianism, which I said, the only way that you can address the spiritual issue, a spiritual issue is collective in its nature. So if you're looking at a collective issue that we all share, an individual, this is why like self-help and all the kind of new age spiritualism, it touts the same kind of utopianism or unavowed autism as what a lot of spiritual traditions do. And so you're never looking at the context of the disease that you play host to collectively, which is a collective disease. So think of, if you are removing want, to remove a want, the satisfaction of a want is to remove dis-ease, and so therefore have an improvement in well-being. How is it any different to understanding that we share a collective disease, but if it's a collective disease, we have to move it collectively? So that collectivism, as it were, is not socialism. It just predicates that you acknowledge something claims you as far as the disease goes, but you play host to it, but it doesn't exist. It exists within you, but you are not the cause of it. You are play host to it. It's a spiritual disease. So if it's a spiritual disease, then it requires looking at, well, hang on, who else plays host to it? And you recognise that you do. Well, then the only way that you can overcome it is if you work in concert with other people, whereby the understanding of what you're orientated towards, so the specific ideal, is not the galvanizing force that you think it is. So you're working towards a common surpassing rather than individualizing the pursuit of it, which is just presupposed. This is the whole thing. If you orientate towards independence from the they, there's nothing that's presupposed in that orientation. It's a given. So if you're looking at cultural transformation, if you're looking at the provocation of Nietzsche in that regards of transvaluation of values, well, then how are you demonstrating anything that's claiming you in a noble way that's worthy of the heritage that we've discarded, but that we're not necessarily beholden to? So in that manner, the remains are there. What remains? How can you potentialize the remains? And so the context which I work is that, well, how do you work? You work where you are. So some people that are religious, and some people belong to a church, synagogue, mosque, or whatever. You actually can work through those contexts. Now, other people that are atheists or humanists that don't have any kind of like hub or collective kind of sharing of ideals or ideas, and then are more kind of isolated, which essentially like I am. I mean, I'm neither an atheist nor I'm not religious, and I have no affiliation with anybody. But then it's like, well, how do you take the creative scope of what existed prior, but then do it in a way where you start to create a world or create a people where you share in the creation of the world in a manner which is not beholden to a religious thinking and mythological thinking for that matter. So then what you're doing is that you literally, the faith that you have, it's a faith in a knowledge. So you can demonstrate faith. People always think that faith has something to do with belief, but it obviously it doesn't. It's not beholden to it. The way it gets framed within the West in particular, because of Christianity, it does. But you can have a faith in a process or a faith in an understanding which is really based upon knowledge, and it's upon understanding. Well, if we're looking at the context of what we're dealing with, and we're dealing with the convention of money, then understanding the nature of what it is really, and the way how it's not neutral, the way how it presupposes a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, and that is just the money is just a symptom. I always kept coming back to it. It's a symptom. It's an effect. It will fall off. If you're looking at the way how you can surpass the problems of civilization, it's the way how we accept ourselves as marginal. All right, it's not an end unto ourselves, as it were, whereby you can orientate yourself towards life with that indivisibility, very much like the child. And this is the one thing that Nietzsche advocates. I mean, he goes through I think it's the camel. I can't remember bloody them because I haven't read Nietzsche for like years. It's the camel. What's the other one? I know that there's the lion, but it's the child that plays. You know, and there's lots of philosophers that, you know, throughout history that talk about play. So if we think that what we're doing was we're unlearning a lesson, well, we have to become childlike, because our acculturation has been a lesson for us, and we're now getting to the point where we're reflecting upon what we've accepted, that lesson that we've accepted for life. Now, if you get to the point where you consider it and, you know, throw it into relief and think, well, that's not the best way to approach life. So you work back, well, where are we orientating our understanding of what would constitute life? Where does that occur? And it occurs very early, it occurs very young. You know, our education is nothing but habitualizing the presupposition of a captivation towards life, where it's more the want of life rather than life itself. Because to be market orientated means to say that want is primary, and then you will always have a want of a self. And the want of a self invariably is that want of that sovereign self that's removed the ideal of independence. And yet, if we're going to lay claim to creativity and consider what we can sacrifice towards a greater good, to something ennobling, where we actually receive ourselves in a completely different way, in a much more richer way. Because I always say that if independence is your goal, then the only thing that you can temporalise is hired help. I mean, that's it. Invariably, that's what it is, because somebody's going to mow your lawn, somebody's going to, like, you know, kind of, I don't know, it depends on how wealthy you are, but that's essentially what it is. There is no people, all right, when that's what you resolve upon. Anyway, so I thought it's just another way of approaching what we've talked about, but looking at maybe, you know, just the, you know, certain kind of figures that talk about the problem of, well, the spiritual issue or nihilism or whatever, but then go so far, but then don't kind of, they come right, like Nietzsche came right into the marketplace, and yet didn't have the insight to actually kind of meditate upon that to the degree that maybe it would have facilitated, you know, some thinking that otherwise wasn't the case. And he's maybe more beholden to metaphysics than what he thought. Anyway, until next time, take care.